The central challenge of the economy now is not the budget deficit. That is a challenge. It's a long-term challenge, and I will address that. But the central challenge right now is jobs and wages. And to some extent, there's a tension between dealing with the long-term budget deficit and dealing with jobs and wages. And that tension is exemplified by the fight over the fiscal cliff we had coming into the year and we now are about to have once again, and also is exemplified to some extent by other showdowns that we are likely to have over, for example, lifting the debt ceiling and continuing resolutions to keep the government going. The tension, plainly put, is simply this, that if we do too much deficit reduction too quickly, we rob the economy of the demand it needs to keep going at or near full employment. In 2008, for those of you who remember, there was a major fall-off in consumer demand. Why? Because we had a huge bursting of a housing bubble, and people found themselves much poorer than they thought they were. Many people, because they felt poorer, they stopped buying. Businesses are not going to create jobs. In fact, businesses aren't going to even keep people employed if there are not adequate numbers of customers. This is not rocket science. This is just intuitively obvious. And so you can get very easily into a downward vicious cycle in which there are fewer and fewer customers because there are fewer and fewer jobs, and that means people have less and less money in their pockets. That means fewer and fewer customers. Now, what is it that government does in those situations? Well, what we learned, and we had a painful lesson in the Great Depression, is that when there is not adequate consumer demand, and consumers and consumer spending constitutes roughly 70% of economic activity in this country. Well, when there's not enough consumer demand, when consumers are worried, when they are losing their jobs, when they have lost a big chunk of their assets, when they are not ready or willing or able to go into the shops and stores and buy all sorts of things, then government has got to stand ready to be the customer or consumer of last resort. And again, this is not a new doctrine, but it's newly applied because between the late 70s and 2008, the major problem we were concerned about in the economy was inflation. It wasn't recession. The major continuing problem, or the background problem, was that things would get out of control, that there would be wage and price inflation, that prices would start rising too quickly. But beginning in 2008, something else happened. We began a different era, an era much more closely aligned with an era that began in the early 30s. In fact, one might say 1929. An era in which the ongoing economic problem wasn't inflation. It wasn't too much demand. The ongoing economic problem was the potential for recession or depression, too little aggregate demand. In the last quarter of 2012, the economy actually contracted. The United States economy contracted. Why did it contract? Well, consumers are still worried. They're still upset. Unemployment is still 7.8%, and that doesn't even include all of the Americans who are too discouraged even to look for work, and it doesn't even include the millions of Americans who are working part-time who'd rather be working full-time. And so if government in the last quarter of last year is cutting, and many of the cuts, in fact there was a 22% decline in spending on the military, on national defense in the last quarter of last year. If we are pulling in our public spending at the same time that consumers are still wary, there is not going to be adequate demand for all the goods and services we could produce, which means unemployment is going to stay high, which means we are in a very fragile recovery, a fragile recovery. This continues to be one of the most fragile and anemic recoveries on record. We do need to deal with the budget deficit over the long term. But that budget deficit over the long term is being fueled, or will be fueled, primarily by two things. One, rising healthcare costs, and two, baby boomers who are aging. 76 million of us. I'm a baby boomer. I was born in 1946. Bill Clinton was born in 1946. George W. Bush was born in 1946. Anybody who was anybody was born in 1946. Cher. Can you believe it? Cher. Every time I get a little bit discouraged, I think of Cher. Now, why were we all born in 1946? We were born in 1946 because, well, in my case, my father was in the Second World War, and he came home. And there was my mother. Demographics is not complicated. My point is that the future, the big deficits of the future have to do with healthcare costs and boomers. And boomers needing more and more healthcare. Healthcare is already about 18% of the entire gross domestic product of the United States. 18%. And if we don't actually figure out some way of controlling this, it's going to be up to 25% by the time the boomers have all retired. Much of the puzzle for what to do about health care, and tonight we're not really, and we don't have time to talk about health care, but it has to do with prevention, figuring out ways of preventing ill health, preventing diabetes, preventing some forms of cancer, and we know how to prevent them, preventing heart disease, and we know how to do this. It has to do with prevention. My father began walking 3 miles a day when he turned 80. Next week he's going to be 99. And we have no idea where he is. Beginning in the late 70s, when wages began to flatten, for reasons that, if there's time, I will get to, Americans continued to spend, but they could only spend by engaging in several coping mechanisms that are now exhausted. Coping mechanism number one, women into paid work. Now, bear with me on this one, because poor women had been in paid work right along, and women had been working right along. But women in the late 70s and 80s, and increasingly the 90s, wives and mothers, women went into paid work in extraordinary numbers, a great wave. We had never seen anything like it in this country. And I wish I could tell you it was because of all the wondrous, wonderful professional opportunities open to women, but it was not primarily because of professional opportunities open to women. Women streamed into the workforce mainly to prop up family incomes that were being jeopardized because male wages were stagnating or declining. And coping mechanism then, number two. When that first one was exhausted, there's a limit to how many wives and mothers can go into paid work. When that coping mechanism was exhausted, the second one was everybody working longer hours. By the 1990s, when I was labor secretary, I was amazed when I looked at the data. The number of hours the typical family was putting in, 300 hours more than the typical Japanese or European. I mean, we were working ourselves to the bone. It wasn't just hourly workers and wage workers, it was also professionals, billable hours, women and men. I came up with an acronym describing these families, the women and men, both of whom were working long hours, barely saw each other. I call them DINs, double income, no sex. We have a deeper structural problem right now. That deeper structural problem is not just government is not capable or is spending enough to make up for consumers' unwillingness or inability to spend. The deeper structural problem is that wages are going nowhere. In fact, The median wage today is 8% below, adjusted for inflation, what it was in 2000. Most of the new jobs created since the bottom of the recession pay less than the jobs that were lost in the recession. It is extraordinarily, extraordinarily frustrating. Politics comes from the Greek root poly, meaning many, and ticks, small blood-sucking insects. I don't really mean that, but that's certainly how it feels sometimes. It's not just Washington that's divided. This country is bitterly divided, and I think more divided than I remember. And part of the division is that we don't any longer talk to each other. That is, across the divide of ideology or party politics. It is so much easier today to live in places where the only people you come across are people who agree with you. It is so easy in this age of internet algorithms to read only things that confirm your point of view. The only way you learn anything in this life is to sit down and talk with somebody who disagrees with you. Right after the Watergate scandal, when the public became so outraged at what money had done to our political system that it put pressure on our politicians to pass campaign finance reform. We're drowning our political system and our democracy in money, and the money is not coming from small contributors. It is coming from big contributors and bigger contributors. One final point. Alan Simpson, a senator from Wyoming, Republican, with whom I see eye to eye on nothing, literally or figuratively. He's very tall. But he is a dear friend, and we were talking recently, and he is getting more and more upset about all of the money in politics, and he said to me, he thinks if it continues to go in this direction, it's going to be possible for a handful of billionaires to purchase the next president. And I think he's right. And we cannot tolerate that.